the lecture. Okay, so today we're going to talk about chapter 4. And this is all about consciousness. This is one of my favorite chapters because my specialty is sleep. And so I really enjoy talking about different concepts with sleep. And also for the activity for you guys, I have you guys do a sleep diary, which is really fun to kind of see what kinds of patterns you have with your own sleep, and then hopefully be able to improve them based off of what you've learned about your own patterns. So before we get into sleep, we're going to talk about consciousness. And so I always like to kind of start with a definition. In every chapter, you'll see that we define terms early on into the chapter so that everyone's kind of on the same page. And consciousness is one of those really interesting ones where you actually don't have a standard definition across all scientists. The definition of consciousness changes based off of field. It changes based off of discipline. So psychologists, mathematicians, philosophers, medical doctors, they tend to all have different definitions of what consciousness is. But it really kind of stems down to the idea of awareness. So what constantly changes our idea of consciousness and our perception of what consciousness is really these special cases where we have somebody, for example, who's in a coma, somebody who might be not aware of their surroundings outwardly, but perhaps could be what we refer to as locked in. So there is a syndrome called locked in syndrome, where you're in a coma and outwardly it looks like you have no idea what's going on and that you're not aware. You're not able to give a sign that you can hear somebody. You can't wiggle your toes. You can't move your eyes, but you actually are aware of what's going on around you. It's a very terrifying idea, but it does exist. And this is something that challenges our definition of consciousness because they're not able to relate to us that they can understand us. And it's not until after something has happened, maybe they've woken up from the coma, like woken up in terms of they can actually communicate. Or if we do special studies, like have them go into an fMRI scanner and actually see their brain activity is showing that they're aware, that challenges our definition of awareness. We also see cases of people who have really rare conditions where, for example, they might have had brain damage or they've had a stroke, and they may not necessarily be aware outwardly, but they can actually see things and be labeled as blind. So there's a special kind of awareness that you can have called blind sight, where you might be, considered medically blind. You can't see anything in front of you. You don't see, you don't see an object in front of you. But yet, if you were to walk in a straight line, you can actually move around this object. And so that challenges our idea of consciousness. And so, you may say, well, I wasn't aware of it. I didn't see the object in front of me, but you're able to move around the object. Then that tells us that something is going on in the brain that is allowing us to be not outwardly aware, but somehow internally aware. So there's tons of different examples of how we need to think about what consciousness is. I've got a definition here, though, that sort of satisfies the basics. And that is that consciousness is this immediate awareness of your internal states. So your thinking, your feelings, sensations of touch, and your memories. And being able to be aware of the external world around you. So being aware of what's going on inside and aware of what's going on outside. Now, William James was, and we've talked about William James before in this class, he was a very big influencer in psychology and behavioral psychology. And William James in 1892 described consciousness as a river or a stream. And so William James contributed quite a bit to what we know in psychology and how we think about behavior and physiology and the brain, and really helped us understand how we should define consciousness. And thinking of consciousness as a stream is really a way for us to think about the past, the future, the present, and be able to determine how we're going to behave and how we're going to guide our own thoughts, and maintain our own sense of self in the here and now, based off of what we've learned and based off of what we know of the future. And so consciousness, to William James, was a multifaceted thing. It was a very, very interesting sort of take on how we think about consciousness. Now, one thing that's really fun for this class is this idea of awareness and thinking about attention and paying attention. And so there's a video that you guys can look at, and I usually show when I'm teaching this face-to-face, where I play a video about attention and inattentional blindness. And so you can actually look these videos up, and you can actually look this clown video up as well. And it's a pretty fun experiment where you can have a person who is in the here and now and just literally not paying attention to what's going on around them and missing something really, really big. Like, for example, this image of this clown on the unicycle. So this is an experiment done to see how many people in this university square actually saw this clown on a unicycle. And what they found is obviously people who were on their phone or who were engaged in something other than simply looking around missed this giant clown right in front of them. And so you can actually see the person to the right of the clown looking up and looking very confused. And you would say that it's pretty obvious that that person has noticed the clown. Whereas the people to the left, especially what looks like the girl with the red bag, she's looking down at something, not paying attention. So we miss things, obviously, that can be right in front of us if we are not we're not consciously aware of the things that are right in front of us if we're not paying attention. So let's talk about attention here. Okay. So attention is limited. Okay. You're going to focus on what's important and what's in front of you. And it has a limited capacity. Okay. You select what you choose to pay attention to. You could be sitting in class and the teacher could be teaching, or the professor could be teaching or lecturing, and you can be on your phone. You can be, have your laptop in front of you and watching subtitled Netflix shows and completely miss what's going on right in front of you. The professor may then say, this is going to be on a quiz. And because you're selecting to not pay attention to that and pay attention to what's in front of you, whether it's your laptop or your phone or whatever, you're going to miss that. You're not able to multitask very well. There's been plenty of studies to show that multitasking really doesn't work. A lot of people think they're a whole lot better at it than they really are. And it turns out that they really miss a lot. So you can do one thing really well, pay attention to one thing really well, or pay really crap attention to two things or three things. And so that's the reason why we make mistakes, right? If we're driving and we're, using our cell phone, or we're playing with the radio, or we're trying to eat a taco, and, trying to drive and do that at the same time, you're going to mess something up. You might run off the road. You might drop your taco. Something's going to happen. We tend to not be really that great at doing multiple things at one time. So when we talk about attentional tasks and thinking about what are we actively paying attention to, we find that a lot of times attention can be blind. We can miss things right in front of us. There's a few experiments that I do like to show in terms of videos that are kind of fun ways to see something called inattentional blindness. And that's when you can be focused on a task and completely miss something that's right in front of you. So there's a video of a really famous experiment where, and you can look this up on YouTube, and I believe I do have the video up on Moodle, if I'm not mistaken. But there's if you Google inattentional blindness experiments, you can find a lot of different versions. One of those is the gorilla experiment. And so really what you're doing is you're told to watch a video and count the number of passes between players wearing a certain color shirt. And so they have a basketball and they're passing the ball from person to person. You have to count how many passes that you see. And what's happening while that's occurring is that a person in a gorilla suit walks by. And so because you're so focused on counting the passes, you actually miss a lot of times, about 50% of people miss the gorilla walking completely by. And so this is kind of a fun test on inattentional blindness, that you become so focused on a task that you miss something that's clearly in your field of vision, and a significant object that you just are not paying attention to. Another kind of blindness that we see is something called misdirection, which is something that magicians use because magicians are experts on attention. They know that people can only pay attention or focus on really one or two things at a time, usually one thing really, really well. So they might say, okay, I want you to look at this here, but over here they're doing something with this hand that you're not paying attention to. Pickpocketers also do this with misdirection. A lot of times they'll bump into you with a shoulder, but then while you're focused on that activity, they're, taking your wallet out of your bag or your pocket or something like that. And so misdirection is just taking advantage of the fact that attention is not only selective and focused, but it's also limited. We also have inattentional deafness. So I'm sure many of you have, had a moment where your mom or your grandmother is calling you and yelling your name and saying, John, I've been calling you for the past 5 minutes. And John says, I didn't even hear you. I wasn't even paying attention. So we experience this all the time where, you might not even had headphones on. You physically could have heard the name calling and yelling at your name, but you just simply were paying attention to something else. And you perhaps music or something audible or auditory, and you just completely missed it. So we all have examples of doing this. Change blindness occurs when we don't notice something that actually changes. A lot of times this occurs because we're really not paying that well attention in the first place. Probably the best example of this is if you ever, and I've done this before and I've always felt bad, but if you ever go to like a restaurant and let's say you have a waiter and the waiter comes by and he takes your order and you say, okay, thanks. And then you wait for the waiter to come back to take your food order. And then sometimes what happens is there's like a shift change. And so the waiter might change or the waiter changes tables. And so the waiter comes over and you don't actually notice that the waiter changed. You might have not even realized it and just thought it was the original waiter. And so you go, oops, I didn't know that you already knew that, or I had already said that, I was assuming you already knew that because you're the same person. And so that can be obviously problematic if you don't notice the change that occurs. But this happens a lot of times. If we're not paying really close attention, or if the people kind of look similar or dressed similar, sometimes if they have the same kind of hair color, where there's not really, a distinguishing factor between the two waiters or waitresses, then a lot of times people do make that kind of mistake. So, one thing that's important about this idea of consciousness and awareness and paying attention to things is that it does go nicely into this idea of what are you aware of when you're sleeping and what is sleep. So we're going to talk now about sleep itself. We're going to talk about our body rhythms and what we do while we sleep. And I have a feeling that probably the rest of this lecture will be pretty much based on just sleep. The rest of the PowerPoint slides are for this idea of awareness during drug use and how drugs impact our consciousness and our ability to process information. And types of drugs and things like that. So we're probably going to focus mostly on just sleep at this point. So we're going to jump right into the biology of it. So one thing to think about sleep is to understand the idea behind the circadian rhythm. So we all have clocks in our brains, really. Each cell in our body has a set of instructions. Every cell has a timeline. It has a lifespan. And in thinking about that, it also has a sort of a clock in of itself. And so every groups of cells, work on certain kinds of timelines other than other cells. Some cells will have a very short time frame where they do what they need to do, and then they die, which is called apoptosis. And then we have other cells that go on to live a much longer span. Our body itself runs on a clock. It runs on a rhythm. And scientists think that they've really narrowed down your body's time setter, its main clock. And so the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain is the place that we think is where the main clock is. So I'm going to do a pointer here so that I can kind of show you guys where we are. Okay. So hopefully, okay, so you should see a red dot on your screen, and this is me kind of like going through the slides. So if you look at the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is located right here. Now, supra means above, and chiasm refers to the optic chiasm, which is where the eye nerves meet. Okay, so it's above the chiasm. That's what suprachiasm means. Okay, so the suprachiasmatic nucleus is a very important area in the brain. It's a specific nucleus that responds to signals of light. And so when a circadian rhythm, circa means about, and diem, it means day. So circadian means about a day. So your circadian rhythm is your body rhythm for the day. And everything in your body has a rhythm. Your heart rate, your blood pressure, all of that. If you measure your blood pressure every hour for an entire day, you'll actually see that it has an actual rhythm. It has a pattern. And so our sleep and wake pattern, those are initiated by light. So light is something that we refer to as a Zeitgeber. A Zeitgeber is a cue that tells us what time it is. And so for sleep, our best Zeitgeber, our most powerful Zeitgeber is light. Light is what tells us what time it is. It tells us when to do what we need to do, when to go to sleep, when to wake up, all those sorts of things. And so light starts the process, and especially bright light. And so sunlight has all the spectrums of light in it. And it is what we refer to as bright light. So sunlight is bright light. You can also find bright light in bright light boxes, which are like little lamps or big lamps that can produce something that's similar to sunlight. That's what helps regulate our cycles. Okay. Now, one important part of this starts with the eyes. And so the eyes have very specific photoreceptors that are able to detect light. And so when the light enters the eye, and so this is why you may or may not realize, but people who are blind or who don't have eyes really have a hard time maintaining a proper body rhythm. And so many times they might have to take medication or find other ways to be able to regulate their body cycles. And so they can be very difficult for people who are blind or who don't have eyes. So it's because it's so powerful. It's so important. So the eyes have these special photoreceptors that are able to identify light. And so when the sun is out and bright, okay, we get the signal through the eyes, and it goes through, the signal goes through the optic nerve, and it sends a signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Now, the suprachiasmatic nucleus right here is a part of many nuclei in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is made up of all these different smaller pieces, and it has a lot of different functions. So it can help regulate temperature, it can help regulate appetite, it can help regulate a lot of different body rhythms and body processes. But right now we're focused mostly on sleep and wake. So in the hypothalamus, you have the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it receives messages from the eyes that say, light is here. Okay. And so it sends this message through the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And then that signal will then get sent from the suprachiasmatic nucleus to the pineal gland. Now, the pineal gland is a very important gland that releases a lot of different kinds of hormones. One particular kind of hormone that it produces and releases or signals is melatonin. Now, a lot of people think they know a lot about melatonin, okay? And a lot of people try to take melatonin and don't realize that the body itself produces melatonin. So melatonin is supposed to signal when you should feel sleepy, okay? So a lot of people think that the only thing that signals for you to feel sleepy is melatonin, and that's not the case. Melatonin is just one of the processes, one of the hormones that is involved with sleepiness. It is one that we know a lot about, so we talk a lot about it, and a lot of people hear about it. So a lot of people think that it's the only one, but it really isn't. Melatonin is just one of the major processes. Now, light suppresses melatonin. Because melatonin makes us sleepy, right? When you wake up in the morning, you would hope that light shuts this system off and tells the pineal gland, do not produce melatonin right now. Okay. So first thing in the morning, you'll see that your melatonin levels should be start decreasing. Okay. And then later in the day, as the sun goes down, okay, that signals to the pineal gland that light is being removed from the eye, and therefore you should start releasing melatonin because that starts a process of making you feel sleepy. Now, if you were to look at a person's melatonin release, their natural release really starts around the sun going down. So that depends. So like in the wintertime, the sun starts going down at 5 or 6 p.m. really. That's when you might start to see the sun, the melatonin start to release slowly. So it slowly releases over the course of several hours, and then you start to kind of feel sleepy. Well, the peak release of melatonin is about 3 a.m. So a lot of people think that you release most of your melatonin early in the evening, make you feel sleepy. But it turns out that you release the peak amount of melatonin at about 3 a.m. And that's because when you are asleep, if you go to bed at 11 p.m. and you're asleep, you want to stay asleep. So your peak release will probably be around 3 a.m. so that it keeps you from waking up and being too awake. And so that peak release is about 3 a.m. And then after that point, it starts to very slowly kind of taper off. And then when the sun comes up, you should have a really, really quick tapering off, and the melatonin is suppressed, meaning that it's not being released. So then now you have this period of time where it's, you're not having really any melatonin release at all. And so what ends up happening is that when you go buy melatonin over the counter, first it's labeled as a supplement. So the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, actually does not regulate supplements in the sense that they check to see how much melatonin is actually in the supplement. So it could, the person or the company that made the melatonin could actually not be truthful on how much melatonin is in the supplement. So you could be buying something that really doesn't have a lot of melatonin in it, or the dosage is completely off. So there's several kinds of melatonin that you can buy, and there's some that are quick release and some that are slow release. So because most people don't understand how melatonin works, most people take it incorrectly. And then if it doesn't work properly, they think, oh, well, it just doesn't work for me. Well, if you get fast release melatonin and you take it, and if your doctor tells you to take it, they're going to give you a prescription and they're going to hopefully tell you how to use it. So this is different. This is just if you buy it over the counter. If you buy a fast release melatonin and you take it when you go to bed, let's say you go to bed at 10 or 11, you're going to feel differently than if you bought a slow release and you took it at that time. So if you took the fast release too early in the evening, so let's say you're going to bed at 10 or 11, instead of taking it 10 or 11, you decide to take it at 7 p.m., then you're going to feel sleepy really, really quickly in the evening, probably much faster than if you really wanted to go to bed. And then that means that you're going to fall asleep really soon, and then you're going to wake up really early in the morning. So you may want to sleep till 9 and you wake up at 4 or 5 a.m. and you're awake. If you take slow release too late in the evening, what can happen is that it takes too long to release. And if it peak releases at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m., then you might be really, really groggy in the morning, and it may be really hard for you to wake up. So if you take melatonin at the wrong time in the evening, it can either lead to you waking up too early in the morning and being, not able to fall back asleep or wake up in the middle of the night, or it can lead for you to not be able to wake up when you're supposed to and oversleep your alarm clock, or just feel really groggy and not feel well for the rest of the day. Now, our bodies naturally produce melatonin. And so if you take it too much, if you take it and become reliant on it, it could actually change the kind of melatonin, the amount of melatonin your body's going to produce. There's several scientists who argue that, the more you take a supplement like that, the less your body would actually produce. So if you decide to stop taking it, what we call exogenously, or produced outside of the body, if you take it from a supplement, then that could actually lead to you not producing enough on your own. So if you stop taking the medicine or the supplement, if you stop taking melatonin, then you won't make enough for a little while and you might have a hard time falling asleep. So a lot of people who take melatonin also find that they have a hard time with the dosage, that they have to keep increasing the dose because they keep getting used to it. So again, taking melatonin is one of those things that you would have to kind of talk with a sleep doctor about, not even necessarily a regular physician, but you might want to talk to a sleep doctor about, just to make sure that you have the timing right and that you have everything set in terms of how you're taking it. So it can be one of those things where you just have to be really careful. And also, of course, you would want to make sure that you have something that is, guaranteed to be actually melatonin. Okay, so, and if you guys have any questions about this stuff, you can certainly ask me, or you can email me if there's anything that comes up. Okay, so looking at how we measure sleep and looking at how we study sleep in the lab. So when electroencephalography, or EEG, was discovered and created, and that technology was designed, that opened up a whole new world for us, because we were able to actually look at the brain waves during sleep. So EEG allows us, there are electrodes that measure the brain activity or brain waves during sleep, during awake or sleep. But EEG allowed us to be able to test the brain, because many scientists thought, that the brain was just dormant during sleep. It did nothing. It was just a rest period. The brain was quiet. It didn't actually do anything. And so it turns out that the brain is actually very active while we sleep. In fact, a lot of the processes that we do during wake, the brain will do kind of the opposite while we sleep, or different pathways or different kinds of processes happen while we sleep that are different than while we're awake. And so this pattern of activity is very different in some areas of the brain. And it turns out that we've learned that, for example, the brain clears out really garbage and trash and waste that's accumulated during the day while we sleep. And a lot of scientists, especially very recently, have learned that this process of clearing only really happens while we sleep. And so our bodies have a process of clearing out waste through our lymphatic system, but the brain doesn't have a lymphatic system. And so the brain clears waste through its channels of its ventricles. And so we learned in chapter 2 about the ventricles, and that we have cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, that moves a fluid throughout the brain. And so one reason we have ventricles and CSF is to cool the brain. Another reason is probably to clear waste out. And so this process of clearing waste happens while we sleep. And there's a theory that Alzheimer's and dementia, specific kinds that where we see where there's plaques and tangles and taus in the brain that shouldn't be there. They're really just trash deposits. They're not being cleared out properly. And a lot of people are arguing that not getting enough sleep can put you at risk for dementia or Alzheimer's, because it's not giving your brain enough time to clear this trash out. And so we're learning that the brain is not just quiet and dormant and not doing anything while we sleep. It's very active and doing some really important things. And we also know that it's important for memory, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, there are two basic types of sleep that we've learned with using EEG and other methods of measuring sleep. One type is called REM, or rapid eye movement. Now, many of you might have seen this happen before. If you watch somebody sleep, which I don't mean to be creepy, but if you've ever seen anybody's eyes that's closed, but you can see that their eyeballs move back and forth, REM is where we see this happen, and it's really rapid, and the eyes will move underneath the eyelids back and forth really quickly. We associate this type of sleep with dreaming. And so we see this rapid eye movement occur while a person is in their, what we refer to as dream state. Even if they don't say that they're dreaming, we still call this period or this type of sleep REM. We also have another type of sleep, which is while you're sleeping without the rapid eye movement, called non-REM, or non-rapid eye movement, also sometimes referred to as quiet sleep. And that's divided into 4 stages. Now, if you were to take my sleep and dreaming class, of course, we would talk much more in depth than this. So I teach a psychology of sleep class, which is a face-to-face class. And then I teach a sleep and dreaming class, which is during the summer. And during both of those classes, we go into much more detail about sleep, brain patterns, and things that are happening during sleep. But when we look at the brain with EEG, and EEG is the only way that we've been able to actually look at the electrical patterns in the brain. And so that has only with EEG and something we call polysomnography can we actually tell what stage and what type of sleep a person is in. There's really no other way for us to determine the kind of stage. And that's because we need to know what kind of brain waves is the brain emitting during the particular type of sleep. So beta brain waves and alpha brain waves are 2 different kinds of ways that we see the brain emitting during wake and during sleep. There are other kinds of brain waves, but we're just going to do the basics right now. So when you're alert, when you are paying attention to something, when you're not drowsy or sleepy, we see beta brain waves. These are waves that you would see if you put an EEG cap on somebody and you put the electrodes on their head, and you're looking at the waves, and they're paying attention and they're awake and they're there. Then you'll see beta brain waves. When a person starts to feel kind of sleepy and they start to feel kind of drowsy, when you see somebody in class and they kind of do the head bob thing, that's when you start to see alpha brain waves. These are the brain waves that we associate with starting to fall asleep. And then, of course, during other types of sleep, we see other different kinds of brain waves. But when you see the difference on the EEG pattern going from beta to alpha, you know somebody is on their way to going to sleep. So let's talk about the stages. So non-rapid eye movement, or non-REM sleep, is broken into 4 sleep stages. The first stage is the stage 1, where we see alpha and theta waves. So those alpha waves show us that somebody's getting drowsy. Theta is they're starting to see a different pattern and starting to actually fall asleep. We call this the light sleep or transition stage. And you don't tend to spend a really long time in this stage, and you don't tend to go back to it very often. This is just as you're drowsy and starting to fall asleep. Most people actually do not realize that they're in this transition stage. If you're ever talking to somebody and they nod, right? They nod off, and you say, "Oh, you just fell asleep." Or if their breathing becomes really kind of a little bit quieter, and a little bit more rhythmic, and you say, or they even start to snore very, very softly, you might, kind of elbow them and say, "You're falling asleep." And if they go, "Oh, no, I wasn't asleep," they were in stage 1. So most people really don't realize that they're actually drifting off and falling asleep, but this is the first stage. This transitions into stage 2, which is light sleep, or stage 2. This is both alpha and theta waves again. And you're going to see, for example, people being a little bit harder to wake up, but still you're in a light stage. And so it's still not really that difficult to wake somebody up, but it's a little bit harder than if you were to just, if they were in stage 1. So stage 2, this light stage sleep, this is where they've transitioned into sleep and they are actually asleep now. And then you'll see a transition into stage 3. Now, stages 3 and 4 are something that we refer to as slow wave sleep. And we call it slow wave sleep because delta waves are really big, slow waves. So delta waves are associated with deep sleep. This is the really, you're sleeping like a brick, sleeping like a rock. You're hard to wake up. If somebody wakes you up, you are not happy. You are angry. You don't know where you're at. You don't know what's going on. And you don't feel rested if you wake up during this deep sleep. Now, if you're an EEG tech or a PSG tech, somebody whose actually job it is to take this data and actually determine what stage of sleep you're in, many of them would argue that stages 3 and 4 are sometimes, for some people, really hard to distinguish. So it's hard to determine when you leave stage 3 and enter stage 4 because the waves look very similar. And I think that in the next few years in the sleep field, we're probably going to start to see this moving away of trying to determine or distinguish between 3 and 4. Most people mark it as 3/4 because it could be either one. So I think that over time, we're going to start to see perhaps the stages be sort of redone, and it probably is just going to go to stage 3. But just for, education purposes, know that there are 4 stages and that there is a distinction between 3 and 4. They're just really hard to determine in a lot of people. The final type of sleep, which is not an actual stage of sleep, but a type of sleep, is REM, or rapid eye movement. Now, this is really interesting. So we start to see alpha and beta waves again, but you're not awake and you're not in light sleep. You're in REM sleep. The way to determine that you're in REM sleep is now you need to test the muscles. So if you were ever to do a sleep study, let's say your doctor suspects that you might have a problem, like maybe you have sleep apnea where you're snoring a lot and you might stop breathing in your sleep. When you go and you're hooked up to monitors, you'll get the monitors to measure your brain waves. You'll get the monitors usually to measure breathing, to make sure you're, when you stop breathing, if that's the case. You'll have heart rate monitor, and you'll also have MEG, which measures your muscles. So it's like EEG, but for the muscles. And so they're interested in the muscles in your neck, because as you start to fall asleep, your muscles relax. When you're in non-REM sleep, so your stages 1 through 4, your muscles are in varying rates of relaxation, right? Varying degrees of relaxation. But when you're in REM, your muscles are pretty paralyzed. And that's because you don't want to act out your dream. And so you want to make sure that the signal from your brain is that you're in this dream state and that your muscles are currently paralyzed. And so REM can be distinguished from stage 1 and 2 light stage sleep, even though you're still seeing alpha and beta waves, because the difference is that during REM sleep, you'll see very little to absolutely no muscle movement in the neck. And so that is the signal that you're in REM sleep. So when you're doing a sleep study and you're trying to look at what stage of sleep the person's in, you really need to know what are the brain waves saying, so you need EEG, and what are the muscles doing, so you need MEG. Now, some people have experienced something called sleep paralysis. Now, sleep paralysis, for a lot of people, is a very, very scary experience. And so sleep paralysis can happen when, you're falling asleep or when you're waking up. And so what happens is that you feel awake. Either you're drifting off to sleep or you're waking up from sleep and you're awake, but you can't move your body. And so what happens is that many people have hallucinations during this time. And many times the hallucinations are very scary. So they might imagine a dark figure. They might imagine somebody with a knife, somebody sitting on their chest. And so like a demon or a bad person, and they're scared that the person's going to hurt them or kill them, but they can't move and get away. But if you think about it, so if you think about what's happening here in the brain, is there's a disconnect. So your brain is trying to wake up, but your body is still asleep. And so this disconnect usually only lasts a few seconds to maybe 2 minutes, but it feels like eternity because you can't move and you're scared. And this is very anxiety provoking. And we find that a lot of college students actually experience this. I would say one study found probably 20% of college students experience this, and then they think something's wrong with them, so nobody talks about it because they think that there's something wrong with them. But it turns out that it's actually a really short period of time that feels like an eternity, and it feels very scary. But if you think about it, a dream is really a hallucination, right? And so as you are awake, you're really just dreaming while you're awake. That's really the hallucination. And so what people have found is if they really condition themselves to think this is a dream, this isn't real, it's not really happening, they can usually calm themselves down just enough to ride it out. And then once it's over, they start feeling a lot better. And then once they're able to move their body and really wake up, they feel much better. But this is a really scary experience for a lot of people. And so caffeine, stress, sleep deprivation, all of those things can make that worse and make it more likely that you experience something like that. But it's really interesting to see how the disconnect can result in symptoms like that. But REM is really during this period an important process for your brain to do certain activities, and during that process, we tend to dream and we experience very visual, almost like movie-like dreams. Now, if you were to see somebody's cycles all splayed out here, we call this a sleep architecture because it kind of looks like a building if you look at it kind of in squint. So during the night, you usually progress from wake to stage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 3 to 2 to REM. And then you continue on through the night. If you notice that you spend, it runs from 11 p.m. all the way to 7 a.m. As you progress through the night, you spend more time during deep sleep at the beginning of the night than you do more towards your waking time. Each cycle of sleep is about 90 minutes. So you transition from stages, through the stages, to REM sleep every 90 minutes. So it's usually stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2 REM, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2 REM, 2, 3, 2 REM, and then you go back and forth from REM to 2. You don't really hit one quite as much or spend quite as much time. It's usually, that time is spent in REM as you progress through the night. And as you progress through the night, what you find is every 90 minutes you're going through this REM cycle, and it gets progressively longer as the night goes on. So if you were to deprive yourself of sleep by waking up really early in the morning and cutting that sleep off, you're going to be sacrificing REM sleep. But what we find is that if you are sacrificing REM sleep too much, then the night that the makeup night that you go to bed, you'll jump into REM faster and spend more time of that 90-minute cycle in REM. Same thing with deep sleep. If you deprive yourself of deep sleep, you tend to then jump into deeper sleep faster and stay in it a little bit longer during the 90-minute cycle. So there are some interesting things that we see, of course, with these sleep cycles. And we say, okay, well, there's technology out there, like different kinds of alarm clocks and things like that. And that technology will wake you during your most, the best time that you should wake up. If you could control it and if you could time it out, the best time to wake up is during your REM cycle. So while you're in a 90-minute cycle, to get the end of the 90-minute cycle, waking up during REM means that you're going to wake up much, much more refreshed. You're going to wake up and not feel as groggy. And so if you're trying to time and know when you're going to fall asleep, you'll want to kind of time it based off of the end of a 90-minute cycle. And, you might go through 4 or 5 cycles depending on how long you fall asleep. So each cycle's an hour and a half. And then if you do the math, if you sleep, 7 hours, you'll be able to determine how many cycles you're going to go through. And a lot of the technology is just calculating through 90-minute cycles, when the best time to wake you up. So if you're going to try to get a really good, amount of sleep in, and if you really want to make sure that you wake up during your best time, try to wake up during your REM period. So why do we sleep? Dr. William Dement is he has a medical degree and he has a PhD, and he is one of the most well-known sleep scientists and sleep doctors in the world. He was in the lab that discovered REM when they first discovered it. And so he has, he's in his 90s now. And he is considered one of the top experts in sleep. And if you were to ask him why we sleep, his answer would be because we're tired. It turns out that even the top experts don't know exactly why we sleep, the absolute primary reason, but we do know why it's important. So we know it's important in clearing those wastes that I talked about earlier. We know it's important for immune function. If you're sick, it helps heal you. If you're injured or sick, you should get more sleep because that process is going to actually make you feel better, and it's going to heal you faster. It's important for learning and memory. We've learned that during REM and non-REM sleep, different processes occur that help us remember what we recall from previous days and that day previous. So it's actually better if you have a test the next day to, instead of cramming and depriving your brain of the process of what we call memory consolidation or solidifying those memories, it's better to just, instead of cramming, Just go to bed and get 7 or 8 hours of sleep. And that way you're allowing your brain to really, concrete that information in, and then you're going to remember more things the next day. It also helps to regulate mood. We know sleep and mood are very, very intertwined. You know that if you don't get enough sleep, you're crabby. And we know that it's important for feeling good and being healthy. We see a lot of different variations in sleep with different species. For example, if an animal doesn't have a lot of predators, they tend to sleep more. So like, lions don't really have a lot of natural predators, so they sleep a good portion of the day. Some of them sleep as much as 15 hours a day. And if you have a house cat, I'm sure you can verify that animals, the cat species, tends to sleep quite a long time. Grazing animals, like horses and cows and cattle, they tend to sleep in short bursts. So they could sleep 4 hours per day and in different little tiny periods. And we also see hibernation patterns. Hibernating and sleep are two different things. Hibernation and torpor and all those sorts of things are actually not considered sleep. They are you can actually see sleep during hibernation. It's a different state of consciousness. But we do see hibernation occur when, for example, food is scarce or the environment doesn't provide a good enough environment for the animal to live in. We see animals go through hibernation. And so we know that it's important for some species in their survival. But it's interesting to see how that changes from one animal to the next. Now, I talked about sleep being important for memories, right? So this process of consolidation, of concreting the memories so that, they're solid in your brain. The different types of sleep, turns out, are important for different types of memories. So we're going to talk more about memories in a different chapter and types of memory, but just to kind of give you a preview, non-REM sleep, specifically slow wave sleep, that's stages 3 and 4, we find are important for episodic memories, which is something that is personally experienced. So the party that you went to, the wedding that you went to, things that happened to you that you can remember and recall are really solidified during deep sleep. REM sleep and non-REM stage 2 are actually really important for procedural memory. So if you learn a new task, a new skill, if you're an athlete and you're learning how to do something new in terms of like a new move or a new play, and you're using your body and you're using those skills, or if you like to skateboard and you're learning a new trick, those kinds of memories are really solidified during REM and non-REM stage 2. And we find that during the course of sleep, we actually reactivate these memories that we experienced during the day. And this has been actually done in really special studies where they have a person who's going to go through brain surgery. And so part of the process of doing brain surgery is making sure that you are only operating on parts of the brain that's not going to hurt the person's function. So what tends to happen is they'll actually remove the skull and place electrodes directly on the brain. And so sometimes scientists can get in on these patients who are about to undergo brain surgery and say, hey, can we run a study on you where we do certain things? And so we've got several of these studies that are really, really special. So there's one particular study where there was 4 or 5 patients who were getting ready to have surgery for they have epilepsy or seizures, and they're removing part of the brain. And so the electrodes were placed directly on the brain, and the person was given things to remember. They were asked questions about their day and things like that. And it turns out that they looked at the activation patterns, the electrical patterns, directly from the brain while they slept. And it's the same patterns. So we actually reactivate these memories and reactivate these neurons and these patterns and these pathways while we sleep. That gives us evidence that we're actually reactivating and we're consolidating these memories during the process of sleep. So all these connections that are made during the day are getting stronger during the course of the night and sleep, which is why it's so important that if you're studying, that you give your brain the time to be able to solidify these memories. So a lot of people think, oh, what's happening while we sleep? Okay, we know that this is active. We know that we're doing things while we sleep. We can also dream. Many of us can dream during sleep. If you dream during deep sleep, we call this sleep thinking. It's not really dreaming because it's very bland. It's like pictures. It's very vague. It's not story-like. And this occurs during that deep sleep. During REM sleep, we really see dreaming occur. Very vivid, movie-like with a story, even if it doesn't make sense. Some emotion we feel. About 90% of the time, people will report a dream if they're being woken up during REM sleep. Some people say, I never dream. And it could be that you just never really remember them, or that you are never woken up during REM to really think about it and experience it. But the majority of people, even people who don't dream regularly, who are brought into a sleep lab and they're woken up during REM, the majority of them will actually report that they have experienced, that they were currently experiencing a dream. And for some, it's really exciting because they've never experienced that before. And what we find, of course, is that, during the time that you're dreaming, we tend to see that you are actually dreaming about things that you're worried about, things that you're concerned about. If we're, starting school, for example, a lot of people will have that dream of being in the wrong class, or being, in their underwear, being naked or whatever, because they're concerned about their first day of class. We're running a little close on about an hour, and the next few slides are about things like nightmares and sleep disorders. So I'm going to run a little bit over just so that we can cover a little bit of that. So, if you've got class or if you have to head out, you can certainly watch this recorded video. So I'm just going to go a little bit over probably what we originally intended, just because I want to cover these last few slides on sleep. So feel free to log out if needed. This should help everyone else who's watching the recorded version. So let's talk about nightmares real quick. So there's actually a difference between bad dreams and nightmares. So bad dreams are those that you wake up in the morning and you go, oh my goodness, that just did not feel, that was a bad dream. That didn't feel right. It was very, scary. I didn't like it. I didn't like how I felt. A nightmare will actually wake you up. So the difference between a bad dream and a nightmare is they're both unpleasant. They're both anxiety dreams. They could be vivid. They could be frightening. But a bad dream doesn't wake you up. You remember it the next morning. A nightmare is going to wake you up in the middle of the night. These tend to be really common during middle and late childhood. Between 5 and 10, we see those ages really people, children experiencing their bulk of their nightmares. But we do see 10% of adults experiencing nightmares on a regular basis. There's medication that you can take if it's becoming problematic and making it hard to sleep. But usually it's not indicative of a problem. It's usually not indicative of a sleep problem or psychological issue. Although if you do experience post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, that can actually lead to experiencing nightmares, especially right after the event happened, and even years after you experience the event. So for many people, it can be problematic. And so you want to talk to somebody if you feel like that's causing you stress or causing you problems. But what you'll find is that the majority of the things that we're talking about here in terms of problems with sleep, whether it's a disorder, it's nightmares, it's sleep paralysis, whatever it may be, they're usually worsened by things like caffeine, stress, and sleep deprivation. Those are the three top ones that we see being the making sleep issues worse. So I'm going to talk about sleep disorders, and we're going to talk about dysomnias versus parasomnias. So dysomnias is where we see the sleep disorders having issues with disruption in the amount of sleep, the quality of sleep, or timing of sleep. And so insomnia is an example of this, where there's different types of insomnia. You can have trouble falling asleep, trouble staying asleep, both of those things. And so there's actually some interesting theories about insomnia. First of all, insomnia is one of the only disorders or issues that you can have where you actually don't have a test. We don't really have like a really good test that can be done. It's usually word of mouth, or not word of mouth, but it's usually a person going in saying, I am having problems sleeping, and then they can get sleep medication from a doctor. It's difficult to know for sure if a person's having insomnia without them just saying that they do. And so when we bring people in the lab who say they have insomnia, what we find is a lot of times people really over exaggerate the issue. Usually they say they only get 3 hours per night of sleep, but when we test them in the lab, they actually get 6 or 5. And so some people are really bad judges of how much sleep they actually get. There's also an interesting theory that the way that we sleep has changed. And so therefore insomnia is explained by the fact that people aren't used to the new way of sleeping. Before the Industrial Revolution, humans slept in two shifts. They slept, in 2 segments. And so they would go to bed at maybe 7 o'clock and they would sleep for 3 hours. Then they would wake up in the middle of the night, and they would do things like take medication, take care of children, start dinner for the next day, commit crimes, have sex, all sorts of things. Then they would go back to sleep and sleep in a second shift for about 3 or 4 hours, and then wake up for the morning and do their activities. And so if you look at it, they're still getting about 7 or 8 hours of sleep, but it's actually segmented out. And so after the Industrial Revolution, when we started having light at night, what we found is that people stopped sleeping like this. They slept consecutively throughout the night because the workday hours changed and we had light at night and all those sorts of things. And so the argument is that we actually don't, people who have insomnia just aren't used to that kind of sleeping and have anxiety about going back to sleep. And that anxiety stops them from being able to go back to sleep because they're so focused on, I need to get to sleep. I need to get to sleep. And so there's a really interesting therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's CBTI for insomnia. And that therapy is very helpful for people who it changes the way you're thinking about your sleep and helps with the anxiety of the insomnia. And so that's kind of an interesting sort of take on insomnia. We also have obstructive sleep apnea, or OSA. Sleep apnea is where you actually stop breathing in your sleep. A lot of people who snore really loudly, that's a sign. It's not always absolute, but a lot of people who sleep do actually stop breathing during their sleep. You can stop breathing hundreds of times throughout the night. And what happens is that brings you out of deep sleep because you're waking up, you're choking, and you're trying to breathe. It also mimics sleep deprivation because you're not getting enough sleep, and you're also depriving your brain of oxygen, and your brain needs oxygen to live. We also see narcolepsy and cataplexy. Narcolepsy is very interesting, and you can find some really good videos on YouTube, and you can Google those around. And so those are really, really interesting, where you see that a person is they have this very, very intense desire to fall asleep, and they can't help it. They do fall asleep. And so they do this multiple times throughout the day. And really, there's one explanation is that there's a particular brain a chemical called orexin that you lose, and orexin keeps us awake. And so if you lose that substance, then it stops being able to signal that you need to stay awake. And so people can actually keep falling asleep. And then, if you're working at your job and you're falling asleep, that could be dangerous. If you're doing something like working machinery, it's very detrimental to a person's social life and to their functioning just in general. And so that can be really problematic for people. And usually what happens is they take medication to help them sleep better at night and then stay awake during the day. But it's a very hard balance to take, and there's some really severe cases. Cataplexy is kind of like where you see a fainting goat. So fainting goats don't have cataplexy, but it's the same idea where a person kind of goes rigid and falls over. This can be very dangerous because it can happen with narcolepsy. So a person can experience cataplexy if they experience high emotion. So if they laugh really hard at something, or if they get scared, or boo, somebody jumps out and yells boo and scares them, they can actually go rigid and fall over. And in that case, what ends up happening is they can really hurt themselves because they're falling. They can't. Their muscles give out. and they go rigid. And so if they're holding a knife or if they're holding something, they can cut themselves or hurt themselves. So there's some really good, interesting videos on those as well if you look around. Parasomnias are those where we see undesired arousals or actions. So like sleep terrors or night terrors, sleep sex, sleepwalking, sleep talking, all of these happen actually during deep sleep. These occur during arousal during deep sleep. The person doesn't really know what's going on. It can't happen during REM. These parasomnias can't happen during REM because during REM, your muscles are paralyzed, and so you can't move. There is a condition that where you act out your dreams, but we won't get to that in this class. That's a different condition. But these other sleep terrors and sleep sex and sleepwalking can occur during deep sleep, and you really don't know what's going on. And so it can be dangerous because if you're sleepwalking, you can walk out in front of a car, you can walk outside of your house and not really know what's going on. And there's a really interesting a myth, I should say, about sleepwalking, and you shouldn't wake a person because, I don't know, it'll cause their soul to leave their body, or them, whatever. That it's a silly theory. It's a silly myth, because waking a sleepwalker is not a threat to the person themselves. They're going to be fine. You don't wake a sleepwalker because it can be harmful to you. So imagine last thing you remember, you were in your bed asleep, and then suddenly you're waking up, and somebody's like, you're in another room and someone's telling you to wake up. It's going to freak you out. And so a lot of people will lash out. They'll throw their hands out. They'll hit somebody because they are confused. They're groggy. They don't know what's going on because they're waking up from deep sleep. And so what ends up happening is it's actually more dangerous for the person who's waking them up than it is for that person themselves. And so you really just want to lead them back to a safe place, get them back in bed, and hopefully they'll go to sleep. Now, night terrors tend to happen. The person doesn't tend to remember them. They usually look like they're waking up. They sit straight up. They're screaming. They're sweating. They look like they're having a really bad dream. They might be swatting at something. Their eyes are glazed over. And it's very scary for the caretaker because this happens a lot of times in children. But the person is actually fine. Don't hold them down. Just kind of let them, make sure they're safe, and just let it run its course. It usually takes about 15 minutes tops. The person usually just flops back over and goes to sleep and doesn't remember in the morning. That's usually pretty typical. So the last thing I'm going to cover in this lecture is just some strategies for you guys to prevent sleep issues. And most of it stems down to, don't take as many stimulants like caffeine. Watch how the time of day that you consume caffeine. The later in the day, the longer it takes for your body to actually get rid of it. Caffeine has a half-life of about 6 hours, meaning that it takes 6 hours for half of that caffeine to leave your body. So if you drink a regular cup of coffee in the morning, it's going to take all of the day for that whole thing to get out of your system. So if you just keep pounding back the caffeine throughout the day, then it could impact your sleep at night. Being a college student, you might find no problems falling asleep, but it's going to catch up to you. And so if you don't manage your caffeine issue, if you have one, then as you get older, you'll find it's going to start impacting your sleep much more often. Establishing a quiet bedtime routine, getting your body conditioned, your brain conditioned into understanding when sleep time is and when wake time is really helpful. Make sure your bed is, kept for sleep. It's really hard if you're living in a dorm, of course. But if you're able to establish a good, bedtime routine, that's very helpful. And also, create conditions for restful sleep. Make sure your room is cool enough. Make sure if you need a fan, you have one. Turn all your lights out, turn the TV off, turn the computers off. Make sure it's quiet, or as quiet as you can make it, and try to be as consistent as you can. So be consistent in your wake time and your sleep time on weekends and weekdays. Try to give yourself enough time to sleep. That's usually the biggest problem with most people, is that they sacrifice sleep for something else, whether it's homework or tests or studying or social life. And trying to make the time to sleep is really, really helpful. So if you have any questions about any of this material, I know we went a little bit over, but I don't mind that in this kind of lecture, because especially for an online class, because you guys can benefit from having a full video. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Feel free to get in touch with me. If there's anything that you didn't understand, make sure you're doing the sleep diaries and turning those in properly. The more detail that you give on them, the better, because then that means that I can really give you some feedback. Hopefully everybody has a nice day and gets a lot out of this lecture, and we'll see you next time.